He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone today with a bad word to say about the Māori Wardens. Trust me, I've looked. So, colour me shocked when I discovered that there was a moment in New Zealand's history when Māori Wardens were likened to Northern Ireland's B Special Force, and their work was described as a form of apartheid.
It was the early 1970s. Protests against apartheid South Africa were heating up. The international decolonisation movement was well underway, and New Zealand was signing up to the UN conventions aimed at ending racial discrimination.
And that created a bit of a problem for the Māori Wardens. The Wardens had, and still have, certain powers which can only be used when engaging Māori. And that includes some pretty intense stuff. They can literally take alcohol out of your hand, enter your house without a warrant, take away your car keys if they think you're drunk, but only if you're Māori.
Senior officials, including Jock McEwen, the boss of what was then Māori Affairs Department, had decided that the Wardens were discriminatory. They argued that the Wardens operated as a secondary police force enforcing discriminatory laws which only applied to Māori.
And, at the time, this perception created problems for the New Zealand government in ratifying the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So the simple solution was to get rid of the Wardens.
So the government found in 1971 that it could not sign the human rights for Indigenous people because of the Wardens. So they tried to get rid of us. So in 1971 they called a meeting, and we'd lost.
This is Peter Walden, many-time president of the New Zealand Māori Wardens Association and the go-to man for modern Māori Warden history.
We were definitely going to be wiped out, except Graham Dallow, Assistant Commissioner of Police. Him and I were on the Maori Council. Graham Dallow said, "Hold on, Mr Secretary, I have a report from 14 police districts, and they report that wardens are doing. They're budgeting, they're looking after families, they're doing everything right, nothing to do with criminal law or that." And that stopped Jock in his tracks. So what they did, they didn't do anything until 1974. That rata said all Māori Wardens badges and warrants are cancelled. So from 1,400 Māori Wardens, in October 79, we were down to 321 gazetted wardens.
From 1,400 to 300, that's a massive drop.
Right. The Wardens were really on the ropes here. This really could have been the end of them. But it seems like nobody in the department at the time had quite counted on Peter Walden.
Taranaki ko Ruapahu, ko Ruahine, ko Tararua, ko Witiraya na Maunga, ko Rokawa te Moana, ko Kuraupau, ko Aotea, ko Tainui, ko Takatimu, na Waka, ko Taranaki, ko Ngāti Ruanui, ko Ati Haunui e Paparangi, ko Ngāti Hauiti, ko Mu'opoko, ko Ngāti Toa, ko Ngāti Ka Anunu, nā iwi, ko Peter Walden nā hau, tēnā koutou katoa.
Let's go and sit over there. Is that where we're going to go?
Wait,
No.
you go now.
I think Peter's just having a cup of tea first.
Do you want to have a cup of tea first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring this up. I've already started recording.
All right.
There's a uniform, a crisp white shirt, a badge and shiny black shoes.
They usually travel in pairs, and if there's a large event, chances are you'll see them moving through the crowds with that sense of ease.
They are the Māori Wardens. Wātene Māori. What's your most rewarding memory of why you keep doing what you do for the Māori Wardens?
Helping the people. You know, we're here for the people.
But who are they, and where did they come from, and why? And how about that time we nearly lost them completely?
Kia ora, I'm Murdoch, that's Amber, and you're listening to Viz Manaaki, our podcast about Māori Wardens.
Guess what we're doing today, Murdoch?
Warden history? It's not really a guess though, because this is my podcast.
Everyone we spoke to said it would be impossible to tell the history of the Māori Wardens. It's too big. It's different in every part of the country. It's a thing that happens on an almost individual level.
But everyone also said if you're going to try and do the history of Wardens, you need to talk to Peter Walden. Mātua Walden has been involved with the New Zealand Māori Wardens Association basically non-stop since the late 1960s. He became secretary in 1968 and was president 3 times between 1979 and 2008.
No, we weren't. We told her, the sections of the Act were offensive for abusive behaviour, taking keys.
We visited Peter at his place, and he and his lovely wife Lucina tried to kill us with kindness and food.
If you want to pull, do you want to pull some chairs up over to you? Is it easier for you to sit there?
Is that okay for
Yeah,
you?
absolutely.
I'll do
Do you want the couch?
This is something I'm finding about hanging out with wardens in general, near lethal levels of kindness. Peter was so keen to talk about warden history that he literally started in on the goods before we had even sat down.
You know, there were Māori Wardens, but they weren't that visible. We hadn't had the influx into the urban areas of Taurehira from the different areas. And that's what caused wardens to grow in the urban areas.
Then, as we're talking, he comes out with all these other bits and pieces like,
I was driving on the pipeline for Fletcher's. I've owned taxis, GST auditor to Inland Revenue, case manager to, I've been Maori Advisor Officer to Housing New Zealand Manukau, to Wins and Clendon, and then I've been a tour driver in between.
and this,
I was a New Zealand netball umpire.
or this.
I sang with the New Zealand Maori Chorale, that's Ngāti Toa. My other brother Barry, he had a band. He went to Japan with J-Force and he'd go to the American club and he learned to play jazz.
The point is, he's a phenomenon. He's umpiring, he's wardening, he's recording albums, he's like the love child of Beyonce and MacGyver. Peter was keen to tell us actually that his memory isn't what it used to be. But to us, it sounded like he had never forgotten a single thing that happened to him in his entire life.
We asked Mātua Walden what he knew about the beginning of Wātene Māori.
Now, this is a really hard story to tell. It's very poorly documented compared to, for example, the founding of the New Zealand Police. We have fragments, but not really the whole picture.
Also, different whānau and different regions have different stories of how the Wardens got started. But for now, we're sticking to what Mātua Walden said. His kōrero is that the Wardens go back to the 19th century with the first Māori king, Pōtatau Te Wherowhero.
I thought it was 60-something, 1860, but it's 1858, they tell me. And at that meeting, they elected Pōtatau I as the new king, the Maori king. There was no Turanga Waiwai then, and his marae was around opposite Taubury Mountain. So he went home and he appointed specific people to specific roles so he could build the kingship and manage it properly. The first role he appointed was pirihimana, to look after the good people.
Pirihimana means police, but the New Zealand Police hadn't actually been invented yet. What Mātua Walden's talking about here is the very first incarnation of the Māori Wardens.
So, are we saying that the Wardens have been around, unchanged, since 1858?
Well, you've got to remember that in these days, the Crown had very little actual authority of Māori people living on their own land. So these early Wardens are operating in a totally different world than today.
In those days, there were no courts. Magistrates travelled round a circuit every 2 or 3 months, listening to towns and any incidences. They could hear incidences was Pākehā to Pākehā, then Pākehā to Maori, and then Maori to Pākehā. They could not hear Maori to Maori. Pōtatau said, I want these people to look after the good people, the good Maori. That's the start. And they were to look after Maori.
The exact roles and responsibilities of Kingi Pōtatau's pirihimana are tricky to pin down. Like Mātua Walden says, they were there to look after people, keep the peace, mediate disputes, and make sure the king's orders were carried out.
So in Mātua Warden's kōrero, it's Kingi Pōtatau who invents the Wardens, and that's definitely how the story is told in Waikato. But if you go further afield, you might hear a slightly different kōrero. But all of it connects back to Kīngitanga.
The idea of the Wardens then gets kind of adopted and adapted by Māori all over the motu.
It's like someone goes to visit a marae which has a warden and goes, "Oh, that's an awesome idea. We should set that up back at home."
And even some people in the Pākehā government seem to think they were pretty awesome. There's this one magistrate, Francis Fenton, who writes a letter to Governor George Grey, and he has lots of nice things to say about how the Wardens are an integral and high-functioning element of the governance system of Aotearoa. He says, and I quote,
"Such a people, impossible to govern by any external force, promises to become readily amenable to laws enacted with their own consent."
And eventually, the Wardens get legal recognition from the Crown. There's an act passed in 1900 which established them as a legal position of responsibility under the authority of local Māori councils. But is that a good thing?
Debatable. Before this, Māori Wardens were an expression of tino rangatiratanga. They had all the legitimacy they needed to operate in Te Ao Māori already. They didn't need a special badge from Queen Victoria.
Yeah, that's fair. But in 1900, we're operating in a very different New Zealand to 1858. There's been war, confiscation, the Māori population has dropped to its lowest ever level. The Crown is now very much wearing the pantaloons in this relationship.
Yeah, they are the majority shareholder at this point. Anyway, practically speaking, it helps the Wardens and the people they're looking after for the Crown to legally recognise them.
Through all this time, the back half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the Wardens are working quietly in the background of a lot of big stuff happening in Māori history. See above: war, confiscation, etc.
And religious movements, ringatu and rātana churches both had wardens to look after their followers.
Kīngitanga continued to play a big part in the Warden story too. Princess Tupuia Herenga was a huge supporter of theirs.
Yeah, the wardens we talked to gave her a lot of credit for organising a more modern incarnation of the Wardens. But we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay, so that brings us up to where? The 30s?
You know who's been around pretty much since then? Mātua Walden. He was born in the mid-1930s and heard a lot about how hard those days were from his parents and their generation.
We had the terrible depression in the 30s, and there were no jobs. So men would just turn up to get paid a day's wage. In the rural areas, they had the land, the farm, fishing, hunting. In the urban area, they had nothing. Dad used to ride a bike from Eastbourne to Korokoro and Betonia, get the train to turn up at work in the railway yards in Wellington. And I found out later on when he went for lunch, he'd meet another Maori guy and they'd just drink out of a tap, and that was their lunch for the day. And those are the times when the people who didn't come from there were a problem. The depression areas wrought havoc on the rural, on the urban Māori with no home base. It wreaked havoc on the country.
The Great Depression was especially hard on Māori. 40% of the male Māori workforce was unemployed, compared to 12% for Pākehā.
And on top of that, government relief schemes often paid out less to Māori.
The position of the Crown was that Māori had tribal lands to fall back on, so needed less support than the Pākehā working class.
That's a bit dubious, given that the Crown had spent much of the previous century designing systems to extract as much Māori land as possible at the lowest possible price.
Or, just straight up taking the best bits.
But while it wasn't really true Māori had tons of land to fall back on, they did have people to fall back on, including the Wardens.
I think what people miss is in those days you had a Māori Warden. Nearly every marae had one person who's responsible. Everything was run on a tribal background, your hapu. And the elders were there and they were respected, whaia and matua. And that was in those days. There were not a lot of Māori. And there weren't many in the cities. They were still living at home because that's where the food was. That's where your araha was. And that's where you learned, and that's where you helped, or were helped.
And then, hot off the heels of that post-World War I depression, it was wartime again. And the next war and the associated Māori war effort had a big influence on the Warden movement.
Dr. Aroha Harris is an expert in the post-war history of Aotearoa.
Ko aroha tēnei, e mihi atu nei, he uri ahau no te hokianga nui a kupe, no mangamuka, no misimisi hoki. Kia ora, my name is Aroha Harris. I'm an associate professor in history at Waipapa Matarau, the University of Auckland. Yes, and I'm a historian of the 20th century, Aotearoa. So my research is post-World War II research, and so that's where the focus is. And we know that in 1942 there was a Māori Wardens organisation that was established very quickly. There was a nationwide network of about 300 tribal committees set up.
Lots of committees, associations and runanga to keep track on in this episode. But these particular ones Aroha is talking about are only to do with World War II. The idea was that help recruit soldiers and to find people to work in critical wartime industries.
When the war ended, there was a momentum among Māori that they continue the efforts of the Māori Wardens organisation in some way, and they wanted to do that independently of government.
And here, in 1945, we end up in a big power struggle. The Māori War Effort Organisation was by Māori, for Māori, and lots of people were more keen on that system than the Pākehā-dominated Department of Māori Affairs.
The department, meanwhile, wanted these Māori-led wartime tribal committees completely disestablished.
As they saw it, these committees were stepping on their turf.
In 1945, the kind of compromise to keeping these committees going was the Māori Social and Economic Advancement Act. And I'm saying compromise because it wasn't fully independent in the way that Māori people wanted. Like, give us our own organisation and we'll run it, and etc. So, you have this quite a big piece and significant piece of legislation. And that formalised the tribal committees.
In short, these Māori war effort organisations were basically doing the work we associate with the Wardens today. Looking after people, mediating disputes, keeping the peace, you name it.
The Māori Wardens became a responsible position that these committees could nominate people for. And I say responsible because the Wardens were warranted. They would get a warrant.
One of the things that makes this legislation significant is that it gave the committees the power to hand out warrants. And warrants are one of the big things that define the modern Māori Wardens.
Warrants give wardens certain legal powers, and you are going to hear a lot about warrants in a coming episode.
And maybe just as important, they are a source of mana. They're like a licence to warden.
The important thing is that after the war ends, tribal committees get the power to hand out warrants to wardens, and things just grow from there.
Yeah, so you get, I think, about 300 wardens fairly quickly after the wars. It was something that the tribal committees were quite keen about. And I'm talking about the tribal committees a lot, but it's really because I see this kind of network of community based activity happening, which included the committees, the wardens, and a little bit later on the Māori Women's Welfare League as well. So you're kind of getting this great community involvement, and to me the wardens were central to that.
But like Dr. Harris said, the Māori Social and Economic Advancement Act was a compromise. And part of that compromise was that these tribal committees, the ones that gave wardens their warrants, became part of the Department of Māori Affairs.
And therefore they were ultimately controlled by the Crown, not by Māori.
This is a tension that played out right through the period that I'm talking about, through the 1950s and 60s. So are these organisations basically Crown organisations? And I would say yes, in the sense that they become legislated. Or are they community organisations? And I would say yes, in the sense that the initiatives are all community initiatives. The initiatives, the things that the people say they want to do, are coming from the community and what they see on the ground. So you've got this lovely tension between the government and Māori communities, and are they Māori? Are the wardens Māori, or are they the Crown? They've got this warrant that comes from the government. So where do they fit?
That is a very tricky question, and it's going to flare up and cause a whole lot of raru in the very near future.
Anyway, what were the wardens actually doing at this time?
Well, Dr. Harris says that different communities take up these warden roles in different ways depending on the needs of their community. But one thing she says was pretty consistent is that it was the warden's job to keep an eye out for rangatahi.
And at this particular moment in history, this matters. Remember before when Mātua Walden said that previously people lived closer to their marae. Everybody knew everybody and everybody knew everybody's business. Well, the war changed that dramatically.
In the 17 years between 1945 and 1962, Māori communities changed in ways it's difficult to understand from this distance.
The proportion of Māori people living in cities went from 26% in 1945 to 62% in 1966. That's just astonishing.
I watched that in the 60s and the 50s.
Here's Mātua Walden again.
We moved to the bay, and Titahi Bay is a staging house area. So there was a house being built every week. They were assembled in Elsdon, brought out, put together in the bay next week, and they had a crew. And there were 500 houses built in Titahi Bay, and the first people into them didn't have anything. No furniture, no money, no nothing. And I remember I had a taxi taking a Maori fella to his new state house in Dimmick Street, and he didn't have anything, so I took him to the dairy, Clamo's Dairy down by Maruri Street corner, about 100 yards away, blamed it to Arthur and said, give him what he wants and let me know the amount. And 6 months later he came to me and said, Peter, I've got a job, I've got some money for you, the Maori fella, and he paid me back what he owed me. That's what we did.
And that kind of job of wardens that you're talking about, where that wardens were able to kind of help build bridges between the people who were...
We would hear instances where people were having difficulty, and we'd go along and talk to them or bring a fire along. Once the fire came along, that's recognised throughout Māoridom. They are the retainers of the knowledge, both health and spiritual and everything, in Māoridom. And once they came along, they were able to settle the families to be able to look through a new door. I remember one time going round to meet a guy who's being evicted from his house, and he jumped out the back window. And the wife said, he's just run away. So next night I had a Māori warden on every door and every window. When he went to get out, they said to him, the man wants to talk to you. So I talked to him and explained to him. Then I went and talked to his boss. He was a good worker, had a good job, and his boss would look after him. And I said to him, you get one jug when you go to the pub on Thursday nights, no, nothing else, and you don't drink again during the week. when he went to get a second jug, a big brown hen came over his hand and said, the man said, "One, bro." And that's how they looked after one another. I don't know whether you get that today.
Here's Dr. Harris again, talking about what was changing for Māori at the time.
So many things, but the obvious one, of course, is migration to the cities and the need to kind of follow your young people and have some support around them as they moved into the cities. And you get that again in different ways. I think Māori in Auckland, which is probably the city I'm most familiar with, you do get Māori Wardens involved very early in what's going on around Auckland City. But there are also places like the Māori Community Centre in Wellington, Ngāti Pōneke, who are probably most famous as a kapahaka group. We're actually doing quite a bit of community work as well. It wasn't doing very similar work in terms of supporting young people. Churches as well set themselves up as hubs for young people to come together, to congregate and have a space where they can kind of be Māori in what is often, at that time, you couldn't find a Māori space necessary.
So where previously, when everyone was home round the marae, the warden was literally your auntie. But now, in the big city, the warden is more giving big auntie energy.
And I do think this idea of having aunties and uncles around persists, but they might not be blood relatives anymore. And I've talked to many people who established their families in Auckland, different parts of Auckland during this period, and they talk about these families that aren't really blood related. They've become whānau because they were regulars at the Māori Community Centre, or they all joined a sports team together and they helped each other with the childcare and that kind of thing. So you get these non-blood whānau units kind of develop.
Another thing that was happening in the 1950s is the wardens get some extra powers. And these were especially focused on alcohol. For example, the 1951 amendment to the Alcohol Bill gave wardens the power to confiscate alcohol brought onto marae and punish those responsible.
Between 1950 and 1966, the number of wardens across the motu rose from 32 to 625. Warden business was booming, but for all the wrong reasons.
This is not really my research area, the whole history of alcohol and liquor, but this is something that the wardens are particularly known for. I can even, in my own lifetime, recall television images of the wardens being in pubs and talking to Māori people who are drinking. We've had a very mixed relationship with alcohol in New Zealand history in general. So when I think about the so-called liquor problem among Māori, which is what the government tended to call it through the 1950s and 60s, and again I get back to this idea, well, were they racialising the problem with liquor, or were they making Māori a problem because of Māori and liquor? You know, to me, there's this driver around creating images and creating stereotypes about Māori people and liquor, as well as a genuine problem with it, and people talking about it as a social disorder, as a symptom of so many other things that are going on in society. It's a chicken and egg thing. Like, was the problem created because someone invented it first, or was it there and then people kind of got on top of it, or wanted to expose it and talk about it every year for 20 years or something?
So while alcohol abuse wasn't a uniquely Māori problem, as some stereotypes might suggest, it was still a problem, and it was something wardens like Peter Walden had to deal with regularly.
The Flagon era in the 60s and the 50s was the worst. People would take home a crate with 6 flagons in. They didn't have any furniture in the state house, so they sit on the boxes the flagons were in, but they drank. And yes, we'd get called to their homes, and this was because they were no longer within the environment of their iwi. They were just living day to day, and they didn't have anything. But how they could afford a crate of flagons, I don't know, but that's what we dealt with. I watched that in the 60s and the 50s.
And it was against this backdrop of mass migration, flagon crate furniture in empty state houses, booming employment and unlimited flagons that the legislation evolved again, from the Māori Social and Economic Development Act in 1945 to the Māori Community Development Act in 1962. Here's Dr. Aroha Harris again.
Yeah, so that's the Māori Community Development Act, and if I remember correctly, I think that's still the legislation that the Wardens come under.
So one sec, did Dr. Harris just say that the legislation under which the Māori Wardens operate today hasn't been updated since 1962?
Correct. And it gave even more special powers to the Wardens. If you remember at the start of this episode, this 1962 legislation is what people got all worked up about in the 70s.
Like we mentioned, the 70s were a time of big movements all over the world for Indigenous rights and efforts to end racial discrimination.
And amid all this, some people were saying, hang on, aren't the Māori Wardens kind of discriminatory? Like, you know, they can do all these things, take your keys, take your beer, whatever, but only if you're Māori. And this brings us back to the whole tension Dr. Aroha Harris was mentioning earlier. Are the Māori Wardens agents of the Crown, or are they part of Te Ao Māori?
If they are agents of the Crown, taking keys of people based on race looks like discrimination.
But if they're part of Te Ao Māori, then it's an example of mana motuhake. This is Māori looking after Māori.
Remember, the Wardens were doing their thing long before the Crown got involved.
But this is a question Māori themselves disagreed on. One of the main guys who tried to eliminate Wardens in this era was Mātua Rata, a long-serving Labour MP for the Northern Māori electorate, who became Minister for Māori Affairs. He was a progenitor of the Waitangi Tribunal and the mana motuhake movement.
So this is a guy with some serious cred on Indigenous rights, and he strongly believed the Wardens were discriminatory.
On the other side of the political divide were people like Mātua Walden, people who'd actually lived the reality of being a Māori Warden and seen all the good it could do.
And look, cards on the table, I have to agree that Mātua Walden, he knows what he's talking about, and eliminating the Wardens wasn't the solution. Imagine that at the age of 11, I'm standing on the side of the road, and instead of getting a ride with the Māori Wardens, I got picked up by the New Zealand Police. I don't think I'd be making a podcast about how great that turned out, do you?
Yeah, nah. But back in the 70s, it was the anti-Warden side which won the argument on the day.
1974, Mātua Rata cancelled all Māori Wardens warrants, which they previously had for life, and June the 30th, and said you'll now be reappointed for 3 years. He knew that most Māori committees and district councils weren't meeting. So from 1,400 Māori Wardens, in October 79, we were down to 321 gazetted wardens.
This is slightly complicated, Murdoch, so pay attention. Basically, what Peter is saying is Mātua Rata tried to eliminate the Wardens without actually changing the 1962 Māori Community Development Act. He cancelled all the Wardens' warrants, then created this process where, in order to get your warrant renewed, you needed to have your application approved by a committee. Only one catch: everyone knows that the committees basically never meet. So, apply all you like. No worries, we'll just add it to that pile over there that we are not looking at.
And over the next 5 years, Māori Warden numbers collapsed. But then, at a Māori Wardens conference in 1979, Peter Walden took the bull by the horns.
There were 300 people there, including 321 wardens. Anyway, when it came to election of officers, my name came up and I got voted unanimously. I never went to be president.
It kind of sounds like you should have seen this coming, Peter.
No, I didn't. We only went to say hello. So when I became president, over Christmas, I wrote a new constitution. And
You kind of had to start from scratch, eh? When you became the president,
Yeah,
you kind
I
of
did.
had to start from scratch. Again, this is complicated, but in his new constitution, Mātua Walden basically makes all these little sub-associations for the Māori Wardens, which brings the administration back down to a super local level. That creates more pressure to get the Warden's warrants renewed.
Also, by 1979, the National Party had come to power. Maturata was replaced as Māori Affairs Minister by Ben Couch, who was less hostile to the Wardens.
So Mātua Walden and the new minister get talking, and what Ben Couch actually did was put the onus back on the councils to up their game in terms of meetings. He made it really clear that he expected them to be processing warrants and going about their other business. Plus, he also gave them some extra funding, which probably helped. This was the beginning of another Māori Warden renaissance. Peter Walden could claim that credit for himself, but he's too modest for that. Here's how he put it in an interview back in 1983.
The turnaround really was that the fact that the wardens themselves refused to quit. The principle of a Maori warden is quite simple. You are there because the people want you. You'll be there as long as they want you, and when they don't want you, you'll quietly withdraw. Now, the people wanted the wardens right through that period, and they needed them.
Next time,
Our producer, Justine Murray, is with Sophie Tamoni, and together they talk about a tragedy that happened at Justine's marae in Tauranga.
Police were finding it just a little bit difficult dealing with our whānau at the time, who were demanding to go and awhi our tūpapaku who had been left and where she had been killed.
how did the Wardens and the police work together?
Hear that story on the next episode of Viz Manaaki.
Kia ora and thanks for listening.
Thanks to Peter Walden, Lucina Walden and Dr. Aroha Harris. Thanks to Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision for the archival recordings of Insight. Viz Manaaki was written by me, Amber Hamill.
And me, Murdoch Ngaho.
Thanks to our producers, Justine Murray and William Ray. Executive producer, Tim Watkin. Production coordinator, Brianna Uritich-Gregg.
Thanks to Mark Chesterman, the engineer for this episode.
And special shout out to our Auckland studio engineer, Corey Fui Maono. Find and follow Viz Manaaki on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.